This is the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Podcast, Episode 67, the Agronomics of N, P, and K. I'm University of Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason. Today we'll talk with John Jones. He's an Associate Professor of Agronomy on the Urbana-Champaign campus of the University of Illinois and the State Extension Soil Fertility Specialist. I spoke with him with just a week left to go in the month of October. To that point, it had been up to 3 inches short of rainfall and was running about 4 degrees warmer than average. The soils were dry, and they hadn't yet cooled down. It is the fall. Farmers will be finishing up, if they already have not, with a harvest. They'll be looking forward to putting some fall fertilizers on. Let's start with nitrogen applications. There are a couple of rules of thumbs. One of them is the third week of the October. The other has to do with soil temperature. Can you walk me through those and whether those are changing over time or not?
Sure, Todd. So the third week of October is usually a general threshold set related to soil temperature, a little bit to soil moisture, but really connected to soil temperature. And the reason we care about soil temperature when talking about fall applied or even spring applied nitrogen is that when the soil starts to warm up or is already warm, like we're at right now, the microbial life and biology within the soil is working and will convert certain forms of nitrogen to nitrate. Specifically, if we're talking about anhydrous ammonia, there will be a abiotic transfer or transition from ammonia to ammonium, and then our microbes will work through biological processes to convert ammonium to nitrate. If the soil temperature is high enough, usually we put a 50-degree threshold on that, a consistently 50-degree threshold, and then if there's adequate soil moisture as well.
Yeah, so we're above both, actually, well, above one and below the other one. So I think soil temperature is still a little bit too warm, and certainly the moisture has not been there. How important is it to get moisture in the ground so that these knife tracks seal?
Yeah, so the importance of soil moisture is more related, as you just mentioned, to the physical application of anhydrous. So getting a sufficient seal, with whether you're making sure that the wing sealers and closing settings, whatever your system has, are working properly, not cutting through dry clods that aren't going to seal and going to leave macro pores so that we can get losses, or simply get situations where soil moisture isn't being contained around that band of application.
And turn your attention now to N, P, and K across the board. For corn and soybeans, there will be applications that are made in the fall for all three, I believe. And producers are in a tough spot because they really have to manage the input prices this year and how much they're using. I suppose you can start with the nitrogen. That may very well just be the MRTN or the in-rate calculator to use. Can you tell me what your thoughts are?
Sure. So right now, if we kind of think about corn prices, a little above $4, depending on what your local basis are at or what markets you're working with or when you're contracted. But in general, prices of nitrogen fertilizer, again, they've been slowly declining for a little bit, but anhydrous, for example, is below 50 cents per pound of N right now, looking towards liquid formulations a little higher than that. So when we think about the process of looking at an agronomic response to nitrogen and adjusting it for price considerations, which is what the MRTN process does, we're looking at moving towards that ratio of prices between nitrogen and corn specifically that put you within that 0.1 ratio. And generally that is kind of in the middle of the road for the ratios that we usually put out from the MRTN calculator.
When a person goes into that calculator, there are many things that they can adjust. What's important to you that they adjust properly?
Well, a few things that are important to consider, because we do offer the options of selecting your region of Illinois, your previous crop, which we know affects the coming corn crops demand for nitrogen. So those are two things that are baked into what we need to delineate between looking at summarizing nitrogen, corn yield response to nitrogen. But especially the corn price and then the nitrogen price are something that you also will add. And then there's a context essentially that considers those prices. So for example, if we're looking at around a little over $4 a bushel corn, we're looking at, let's say, 40 to 50 cent N. Generally, that should give you, let's say, in Northern Illinois, around 195 to 205 pounds of N per acre optimum N rate following corn, and around 165 to 178 following soybeans. That's going to be a little bit different in Central Illinois when we're talking about around 191 to 200 pounds of N per acre following corn, and then about 173 to 181 following soybean. And then those numbers are coming off of being updated from the 2023 growing season.
Do you need to look at that and say that's my anhydrous application pounds per acre, or is that total pounds?
That would be considering total pounds of nitrogen that's been applied to the corn crops within those data sets. And so if there's going to be spring applications, if you know those are going to be happening with the planter, with herbicide applications, consider those when setting your fall nitrogen rates if those are going to be going out. So those nitrogen rates are considering all applied N to a given corn crop from the fall before, spring, and in season.
Now talk about the other plant nutrients that producers can think about as it's related to cost savings this fall, and which crops they can think about not or holding back on P and K, I suppose.
Sure. Well, the conditions are a little bit different for phosphorus and potassium. Phosphorus fertilizer prices have been staying fairly strong. Potassium may be fluctuating a little bit more, similar to nitrogen. But in general, setting yourself up by having a recent soil test pays dividends for understanding what are the potential for prioritizing specific nutrients, cutting back, or looking at different fertilization strategies. So using those immediate soil tests is really valuable. Now we're in a year in fall of 2024 where perhaps the last soil test was the fall of 2022. If you did have dry conditions that year, it's important to really put that into context as well, because we may have 2 years or two soil test years in a row if you're skipping every year, or if you're going maybe every 4 years, that you only have dry conditions for soil test data. And that can bias numbers specifically in potassium and pH. It shouldn't affect phosphorus as much. When thinking about prioritizing nutrients, you can look at potentially only applying crop removal or a little under crop removal if you're going to be getting into a situation where you don't need to build because your soil test levels are high enough for P and K. So that's an opportunity that usually comes. One of the important concepts, though, is that even though the prevailing, we want to consider the prevailing yield of a given field or system when planning for removal for, let's say, next year, if that's what you're considering, depending on what seasonality you're using for your P and K applications. It's important to note that even though the net returns to P and K are going to be lower and a little unpredictable at some low prices, the agronomic optimum soil test levels doesn't change. And so if we're really focusing on obtaining or maintaining those agronomic optimum soil test levels, that also gives you a little bit of buffer when you have a need to back down on some inputs.
You mentioned a couple of times that if your soil tests were taken during dry years, do you suggest not taking the soil test this year?
I don't suggest not taking them if indeed some showers come up where they do get, let's say, a few days of consistent moisture back in the soil. Taking those soil samples will be just fine, probably provide you with adequate results. You can always delay to spring sampling. In most recent years, we have had some really dry periods into September, October, and November, and the soil moisture is a little more consistent in the spring. So there are options, and that's actually part of my ongoing research is to look at providing fall soil sample interpretations and spring soil sample interpretations. But in general, if you can get out there and grab samples, especially if you're dealing with maybe a 4-year time span since when you last took them, it will have benefits picking up those areas that might not need fertilization for P and K.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Todd.
You're welcome. John Jones is a soil fertility specialist for University of Illinois Extension and an associate professor of agronomy on the Urbana-Champaign campus. You've been listening to episode 67 of the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Podcast. It is produced in conjunction with Rachel Curry, Nicole Haverback, and Emma Eldridge. Like me, they all work for University of Illinois Extension. I'm Todd Gleason.